All right, so yet again this morning I'm on page 165. Now, I did want to show really quickly the word feta. Now, I've been going through this book and oftentimes I'm coming through the word fetters. And I always thought of it as like an odd encumbrance, just like a trouble or something. And then I did discover it's actually a chain that restrained the prisoner around the ankles, and to stop their freedom, confine or restrict someone. So I think that's kind of important to drag back into this because they are using it often. And also we are entering the age of Charlemagne. He's now king of Lombardy. He started this 33 year war in Saxony against the Saxons. Right now they just had a battle and they're all dead on the field. But they are starting also the baptismal situation. They're trying to baptize all of the Saxons. And I found this really good image. This is havefun-with-history.com. Now, I also saw it at Getty, and it has Getty labeled all over it. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to view this without the Getty on top of it. But here we are, we can look at it today, and I think it's quite telling. It's almost indicative of the Latter-day Saints ritual, where they have a massive pond that they put the people in. It's not a bathtub or anything, it's a real pond. And so it's very similar, isn't it? That they're getting there dunked. So anyway, the baptismal is beginning with what's left, but here we are, we're talking a huge long war, and it's not over yet. Now we're at 779. The lateness of the season not permitting the French to pursue their advantage, the king assembled a parliament at his palace of Heristal, where several excellent regulations, or capitularies, were adopted, both ecclesiastical, secular, and the most remarkable of these relate to theft and the franchises of the church. The right of asylum was subject to 1,000 abuses. Charles did not dare authorize, and yes, Charles is Charlemagne all throughout this. Charles did not dare to authorize violence in order to force the criminal from his sacred asylum, but a canon was passed to prohibit such as should take refuge on account of any capital crime at the foot of the altar from receiving any food or nourishment whatever. This was a serious attack on the privilege of ecclesiastic immunity, of which the bishops were extremely jealous. But all their attempts to elude it proving unavailing, it was decreed that theft should, the first time, be punished by the loss of an eye, the second time by that of the nose, and the third time by death. The assembly was no sooner dissolved than Charles passed the Rhine at the head of a numerous army. The Saxons had the courage to wait for him on the banks of which river? On the banks of the Lippe, where their army was cut into pieces. The victor then advanced as far as Wessa, where deputies from the nation came to renew those oaths with which they had so repeatedly violated. He again pardoned them on condition that they should admit priests and prelates to reside amongst them and engage to attend the diet, which he had appointed to be holden the issuing spring at Horheim, on the banks of the Onaca. The Saxons were faithful to their promise. Every means which prudence could suggest was adopted to prevent a repetition of revolts, and several of the barbarians received baptism. So spot on, there they are, getting baptized. This is not the same baptism as the Catholic Church that we know now. I believe they sprinkle something on your head. The king was sensible of the sincerity of their conversion, but being under the necessity of repairing to Italy, he assumed an appearance of content and satisfaction. In 781, the Greeks had for some time stopped the revenues of certain possessions belonging to the Pope, which was situated in the province of Naples, and the sovereign pontiff, in order to make reprisals, had seized Terracina. The affair was the affair was submitted to negotiation, but in the meantime the imperialists retook all the places the court of Constantinople refused to listen to any proposals. I'm sorry, I skipped a sentence. The imperialists retook all the places that had been taken from them. The consequences, the conferences, therefore, were broken off, and the court of Constantinople refused to listen to any proposals, either of restitution or accommodation. The sovereign pontiff requested the king could send him one of his generals with orders to raise an army of militia to enable him to exact justice from his enemies. He gave him notice at the same time that the Duke of Benevento continued to hold a correspondence with Prince Adalgif. Charles, who had the establishment of his children in view, sent him word that before the end of the year he would visit Italy himself. The French king had 4 sons, Pepin by his first wife, and Charles, Carloman, and Louis by Queen Hildegard. Neustria, Burgundy, and Austrasia were destined for the 2 eldest. He had a scheme in contemplation for ensuring a part of his succession to the 2 youngest, whom, for that purpose, he had with him into Italy. He took them to Italy. They left Worms, attended by a numerous and splendid court, and arrived in Lombardy towards the end of autumn. His presence sufficed to dissipate the clouds of faction, and the Pope's dispute with the Empire was terminated to the satisfaction of Adrian. So a little bit going on here with the Greeks, and now the Pope's dispute with the Empire was terminated. Having passed the winter at Pavia, he went to celebrate the festival of Easter at Rome, where the Pope, at his request, baptized Carloman by the name of Pepin, crowned him King of Lombardy, and consecrated Prince Louis as King of Aquitaine. The first of these kingdoms extended, as we have before observed, from the Alps to the Osanto, and the Duchy of Bavaria was afterwards annexed to it. The last comprised Poitou, Auvergne, Périgord, the Limousin, and Gascony. Ah, the best part. Yeah, I know, it's really nice there. Well, I don't know, Limousin was cold winter. The new Italian monarch remained in his old dominions, of which Milan became the capital, and Ravenna the place of his residence. Young Louis was carried back to France in a cradle. He was then only in his 4th year. At Orleans, cloths and arms suitable to his age and stature were made for him. He was then mounted on a horse and conducted to Aquitaine, where he received the homage of the nobles and people. The Abbé Villers tells us that it was during this journey to Italy that Charles held many conferences with Alcuinus, excuse me, a celebrated Englishman. He who had been induced to revisit the king from the high character which he had heard of him. The fact is true, but the motive is misstated. No, the motive was misstated. Alcuinus was librarian to Egbert, Archbishop of York, and brother of Eadbar, who was also the king of Northumberland. Being highly distinguished for his talents, he was selected by Offa, king of Mercia, as a proper person to send on an embassy to Charles. This was the motive of his journey to the continent, where Charles conceived so great an esteem and friendship for him that he earnestly solicited and at length prevailed upon for him to settle at his court and become his preceptor of the sciences. Alcuinus, that's an odd name for the Englishman, isn't it? Alcuinus accordingly instructed him in rhetoric, logic, mathematics, and divinity, and he acquitted himself of his task in so able a manner that he became one of the king's chief favourites. He was treated with so much kindness and familiarity, says Muratori, a contemporary writer, by the emperor that the other courtiers called him, by way of eminence, the emperor's delight. Charles engaged his learned favourite to write against the heretical opinions of Felix, Bishop of Urgell, in Catalonia, and to defend the Orthodox faith against the hierarchical in the Council of Frankfurt, holden in 894, which he performed to the entire satisfaction of the king and council, and even to the conviction of Felix and his followers, who abandoned their errors. An academy was established by Charles in the royal palace, over which Alcuinus presided, and in which the princes and chief nobles were educated. Other academies were also established in the principal towns of Italy and France, at his instigation, and under his inspection. France, says Cave, is indeed indebted to Alcuinus for all the polite learning it boasted of in that and of the following ages. The universities of Paris, Tours, Fulden, Soissons, and many others owe to him their origin and increase, those of which he was neither superior nor founder being, at least enlightened by his doctrine and example, enriched by the benefits he procured for them from Charlemagne. Alcuinus at length, with great difficulty, obtained permission from Charles to retire from court to his abbey of Saint-Martin at Tours. Here he maintained a correspondence by letters with the king, whom he styles King David, according to the custom. All right, so somewhere along the line, in the letters, he's styling him as King David. So that's a little confusing, isn't it? But we now have a scholar bringing in all of this, it's incentive to Charles, and now Charles is going, yes, let's make academies everywhere. Let's start schools, real university. So of that age, am I on the right page? We'll make sure. Yes. Yeah, according to the custom of that age, it was King David listed, of giving scripture names to princes. Oh, I see. The scripture name was from King David, by which it appears that both Charles and his learned friend were animated with the most ardent love of religion and learning, and constantly employed in contriving and executing the noblest designs of their advancement. The learned class. All right, 783 AD. But to resume the thread of our history, Charles, having settled his affairs in Italy, returned to Saxony, where he held a parliament in his camp on the banks of the Lippe. Back to war. The attention of his assembly was chiefly directed the adoption of means for stifling the spirit of revolt, and they imagined that they had effectually fulfilled this object of their convention. But the French troops had scarcely native claim of independence. Charles, engaged in other projects, sent 3 of his lieutenants to chastise them. These were joined by Count Tuderic, a French nobleman nearly allied to the royal family. These were joined by, to the royal family. The Count's military talents were holden in the French army. They proved fatal to the cause they were calculated to promote. The 3 generals, fearing that the victory would be solely ascribed to Tuderic, resolved to engage without giving him notice of their intention. They accordingly broke their camp in great haste, and marching towards the Saxons, who had pitched their tents at the foot of a mountain near the Weser, attacked them with all that confidence which troops long accustomed to success are apt to feel. The Saxons, however, contrived to take their enemy in flank. When the disorder became general and the slaughter dreadful, the few that escaped took refuge in the camp of Tuderic. Many officers and persons of distinction were killed, and among others Guélon, the king's constable. The office of constable began to acquire importance at this period, although it had not yet arrived at that degree of grandeur and power which it afterwards enjoyed, the constable was originally entrusted with the care of the king's stables. His posts were equivalent to that of master of the horse. He had 2 officers under him who were called maréchals, like marshals. Some of the constables distinguished themselves so highly by their courage and conduct that they were employed by their sovereigns in the most important affairs of state, and entrusted with the command of fleets and armies. But they only acted under a temporary commission. It was Matthew II, Lord of Montmorency, who made the dignity of Constable the first military rank. Under the reigns of Philip Augustus, Louis VIII, and Louis IX. So they gave him even more dignity later as a constable. That of Maréchals was it's tough doing all this reading, because at one point, if you eat before, you end up belching, and then if you don't eat, you have a lot of voice. So it's a tough one to balance, isn't it? So I don't want to belch all through, so I didn't eat this morning. So I have a lot of voice. Okay. So here we are. So here, that of the marshals, we'll call them marshals for the English here, who was raised in proportion, and at last took the place of the former. The constable was the chief of the army and council. He took rank of the chancellor, even in the parliament. He appointed the officers, and he gave orders to the troops. The king himself, if an ancient deed in the Chamber of Accounts at Paris may be credited, could not undertake any military enterprise without his consent. This post, having become vacant by the death of the constable Lesdiguerque, was suppressed by Louis XIII. In 785, the defeat of his army proved a source of uneasiness to Charles, who was little accustomed to the reception of similar intelligence. He immediately marched into Saxony with a full resolution to inflict exemplary vengeance on men, whose sole crime consisted in repelling the attempts of a foreign invader. At his approach, their troops dispersed, and their nobles flocked to him with protestations of innocence. We're innocent, please don't. And infidelity. But though he met with no opposition, he seized 4,500 of the insurgents and ordered them to be beheaded. So they pleaded, but it was for nothing. As an example to their countrymen. So the beheading was such as thus an example. After this unprecedented execution, by which he relinquished his claim to humanity without attaining the submission of Saxony, he went to pass the winter at Thionville. There he lost his Queen Hildegard, who was highly regretted by the nation, and some time after he married Fastrade, the daughter of a French nobleman. The consternation occasioned by the recent slaughter of the Saxons was soon converted into rage and despair. Witikind, that brave warrior whom no threats could intimidate, no dangers appall, accompanied by Duke Albion, again roused his countrymen to arms. The insurrection was so general, and the spirit of the insurgents so determined, that the 3 bloody defeats were inadequate to restrain their attempts and reduce them to submission. So they were not defeated. But clemency effected what force could not operate. Charles, filled with esteem for the untamable courage of Witikind, offered him an unconditional pardon, with hostages for the performance of his promise. The noble Saxon, subdued by this instance of generosity, repaired to the assembly at Paderborn, and from thence to the palace of Artigny on the river Aisne, where Charles received him with so much kindness that he became a convert to his government and faith. He was accordingly baptized, and after his admission into the bosom of the Church, he led a life of exemplary piety. Some authors pretend that the illustrious family which now govern France are descended from him. Albion followed his example. They both returned to their own country, where they kept the people in a state of submission and remained faithful to God and their king. So after some fighting with the Saxons, he won over Witikind and baptized him. The expedition into Saxony had nearly proved fatal to Charles. As he was in pursuit of Witikind and Albion, who had retired beyond the Elbe, he received information of a conspiracy against his life. It has been supposed that the new queen was authoress of it. Yeah, just say that, authoress. Eginhard speaks of her as a woman indicted to cruelty, and says that Charles was too condescending to her. Whoever gave rise to the conspiracy, it appeared formidable from the number and rank of those who were concerned in it. Fortunately, however, it was attended with no bad consequences. On its discovery, Count Hafstrade, one of the leaders, had his eyes put out, and the other conspirators were, sent into exile. All right, to recap really from that last section, I wanted to go over again the criminal of a thief. His punishment was the loss of one eye, and the second time he was a thief found was what happened to him the second time around. It was not good. Gosh dang it. The third time was the loss of his life. Oh, they cut his nose off the second time. That was what it was. They cut his nose off, so I'm not sure how he survived that. But yeah, they did have some harsh penalties for thieves. They also had the creation of the school from Alcinius from Britain, brought him in from England, and brought in all kinds of learning. And yet, back to war. Here we are, back to the big old war. with the Saxons. We're at 787. The Empire of France was at this period doomed to experience a continual interruption of its tranquillity. A revolt of the Britons now called the attention of Charles, who had no sooner chastised the insurgents that he repaired to Italy by his presence, disconcerted the hostile projects of his enemies in that part of his dominions. Erigiz, Duke of Benevento, who was disposed to resist his authority, gave up his plan and sent him his second son as a pledge of his submission. The court of Constantinople, on the point of coming to a rupture with France, sent ambassadors to compliment the king on his arrival and to assure him of their friendship. Tassilo, Duke of Bavaria, uneasy under a state of dependence, was ripe for revolt. Well, he was ripe for revolt. He now threw himself at the feet of Charles, took an oath of fidelity, and gave him his eldest son as a hostage. Yes, but being afterwards induced to renew it is difficult in this book because they do say an and then hostage, so almost like as we say today, we say a hostage. They want to say unhostage. His son as unhostage, but in reality we pronounce it a hostage. But being afterwards induced to renew his intrigues, his hostile negotiations were extended to the barbarian Huns. The emperor of the Greeks and the fugitive Adalgifi. He fomented the discontents of the factious nobles of Aquitaine and Lombardy. But his subjects, dreading on his rash designs their own Leslie. They had their own Leslie, something of less, entered the Diet of Engelheim. In 788, Tassilo was arrested by the command of the French monarch. The evidence of his guilt was incontestable. He was condemned with his two sons to lose his head. By the punishment was commuted into monastic confinement, and the Principality of Bavaria was annexed to the dominions of Charles. The fate of Tassilo could not avert the effects of his intrigues with the enemies of the state. The Huns had raised two powerful armies to assist the Duke, one of which they led into Bavaria to ravage the territory of France, and with the other they marched to Friuli in order to support Prince Edelgif, who, assisted by the Emperor, was preparing to invade the Duchy of Benevento. The Empress Irene, fearing that Charles might wrest from the Greeks their remaining possessions in Italy, had some time before sent him a celebrated embassy to ask the hand of his eldest daughter, Rotrud, for young Constantine. The marriage was accordingly settled, and the princess betrothed. A eunuch named Elisee, we'll call him Elisee, was sent to superintend her education, to teach her the Greek language, and to instruct her in the manners of the country over which she was intended to reign. But this alliance never took place, though who was the means of preventing it, its completion, is not ascertained. Theophane, a contemporary writer, pretends that it was Irene who was afraid that such a union might inspire her son with a spirit of independence and a desire of holding the reins of government. Eginhard, Charles' secretary, assures us it was Charles himself who, from excess of affection, could not bear to part with his daughter. That in it prevented the connection from taking place. My gosh, he had a heavy attachment to his daughter. I know that one. Okay, so be that as it may, the emperor, after the marriage was broken off, made no scruple openly to assist the Lombards, who, in conjunction with the Greeks and Huns, now conspired to promote the expulsion of the French from Italy. But the king, without leaving Ratisbon, issued his orders and dispelled the storm that threatened him. I did want to go back and mention that a eunuch was able at the time to actually be a teacher. Charles took advantage of a short interval of repose to send envoys into Africa, Egypt, and Syria in 790, in order to distribute considerable sums of those Christian churches that were oppressed by the tyranny of the infidels. These envoys were entrusted with magnificent presents for Aaron, Caliph of the Saracens, and to that prince had conceived so high an idea, the Caliph of Saracens, to induce him to treat with humanity, be nice to the Christians here, with humanity the Christians that were established in his dominions. So now they're coming back to the Saracen lands and saying, well, we're giving you gifts, be nice to the Christians. And that prince had conceived so high an idea of the French monarch that he sought to purchase his friendship by giving him up the sovereignty of the Holy Land, reserving himself the title of his lieutenant. Among other presents which Charles sent him was a pavilion made of fine linen cloth of various colours. It was so lofty that an arrow shot from a bow could not attain its summit, and so large that it contained as many apartments as the most spacious palace. Okay, so sending him cloth and lots of pockets in it. But what particularly attracted the attention of the curious was a clock worked by water. The dial was composed of 12 small doors, which represented the division of the hours. Each door opened at the hour it was intended to represent, and out it came the same number of little balls, which fell one by one at equal distances of time on a brass drum. It might be told by the eye what hour it was by the number of doors that were open, and by the ear by the number of balls that fell. When it was 12 o'clock, the 12 horsemen in the miniature issued forth at the same time, and marching around the dial, shut all the doors. So the clock was worked by water, though. Let's remember that. It was about this time that Angibert, so well known in the King's Academy under the name of Omar, retired from court and assumed the monastic habit. Right. He was a young nobleman of great talents, and Charles' daughter Bertha was so stricken with his personal accomplishments that she listened to his addresses and had 2 children by him. Nithard, who wrote the history of his times, his own times, and Hanid, whose, interruption. All right, in continuance, repeat. We have Nithard, who wrote the history of his own times, and Hanid, whose fate is unknown. Eginhard assures us that the king would never suffer his daughters to marry. Well, my goodness, he doesn't want them to marry. Which imprudent resolution gave rise to some unpleasant circumstances that he was prudent enough to conceal. This adventure and Hiltrude's intrigue with another nobleman named Odillon caused him no small uneasiness. Rotrud, another of his daughters, also maintained an amorous intercourse with Count Roricon, by whom he had a son named Louis, who was abbot of Saint-Denis and Chancellor of France. In 791, Charles had now resolved to chastise the Huns. Oh, there we go. He's really going to naggle everybody for some war here. Who had renewed their incursions. Well, I guess they did. He accordingly entered their country, forced their entrenchments after an obstinate engagement, and penetrated as far as Rahl, on the Danube. An epidemic disorder, with the approach of winter, compelled him to retire, and his transient exultation was soon interrupted by a calamity of domestic nature. His eldest son, Pepin, impatient to taste the joys of empire, and envious of the establishment of his younger brothers, conspired against the life of his father. The unnatural project was revealed by a priest named Fardulf, who had accidentally fallen asleep in the church where the conspirators assembled. He was awakened by a number of voices and found the associates deliberating on their last measures. Charles was summoned from his bed to learn the guilt of his son. The Parliament was assembled, and the criminals were condemned. But the feelings of a father checked the hand of justice, and doomed Pepin to expiate his crime by a life of religious penitence. Fardulf was rewarded with the Abbey of Saint-Denis. So he still kept his son alive, and in an odd way trusted him. Because even as in a monastic life, he could still have come back to kill him off. I'm going to stop there for a moment. All right, so now the son is in a monastery. Pepin, the son. We are at AD 793. The 2 monarchs, Charles, his other sons, hastened to Ratisbon, and the first news of the conspiracy, which was totally stopped. However, before their arrival, they were received with all the tenderness which their zeal deserved, and the honours that were due to them for their recent defeat at the rebels of Duchy Benevento. Pepin stayed but a short time, as the zealous disposition of the Greeks rendered his presence necessary in Italy. Louis remained with his father the whole winter, with an intention of accompanying him to his next expedition against the Huns. But that project was suspended by the news which Charles received from Saxony and Spain. Count Theuderic had marched with an army of Frisians into Saxony, where he expected to find everything in a state of perfect tranquility and submission. But he was suddenly attacked by the Rüstringen. No, he was attacked at Rüstringen. Well, Rüstringians. I do have the map up. So we're still up in that region. And sustained a total overthrow. Okay. The Saracens, on their side, had taken Barcelona by surprise. Now we're down where the Spanish mark is. Forcing the passage of the Pyrenees, burned the suburbs of Narbonne, defeated the Duke of Toulouse, who had attempted to impede their progress, and ravaged the whole province of Languedoc. The revolts of the Saxons, when left to their own exertions, were never considered as of much importance. But an excursion of the Moors, about the same time, excited more serious apprehensions. Charles sent young Louis back to Aquitaine in order to oppose the Saracens, while he assembled his own army with a view to terrify, though not immediately to attack, the Saxons. He had a grand project in contemplation. It was to open a communication between the ocean and the Euxine Sea. This would have been an object of great utility, as well for internal commerce as for his intended expedition against the Huns, nor was it very difficult of accomplishment, as he had only to form a junction between the Rednitz and the Athmul. The first of these rivers mingles its waters near Ramberg and those of Main, which empties itself into the Rhine near Mayence, and the falls into the Euxine, or also called Black Sea. So we'll have the Euxine being the Euxine, which is interesting since today we're called the EU. The canal by which this junction was to have been effected was intended to be 300 feet in width and about 2 leagues in length. Okay, the whole army was employed by digging it. They completed 2,000 yards of their work, but the softness of the soil, the continual rains, and the falling in of the earth, and the want of 1,000 inventions, which are so common in the present age, compelled them to desist, and the little hope that remained of success caused the scheme to be totally abandoned. In 794, about this period, Charles received intelligence that Isem, king of Cordova, having been defeated in a bloody battle with Alfonso, surnamed the Chaste, Alfonso the Chaste, had recalled the Saracens from Languedoc. Released, therefore, from his fears on that side, he determined to pursue his hostile plans in Saxony. But before he commenced his expedition, he assembled the famous Council of Frankfort, one of the most celebrated of the Western Church. It was attended by more than 300 bishops from France, Germany, Lombardy, England, and Spain. The monarch appeared, seated on his throne, with all that authority which the Christian emperors had formerly enjoyed in these religious assemblies. The heresy of Felix, Bishop of Urgell, had superinduced the convention of this council. It was consequently the first affair that occupied its attention. And sat prelate supported by Epiland, Archbishop of Toledo. Publicly maintained that Jesus Christ, considered in a natural view, was but the adopted Son of God, by which he admitted 2 sons, and consequently 2 persons. This doctrine, already condemned at Euphius, was unanimously prescribed at Frankfort. Proscribed. The next object of discussion was the decision of the Second Council of Nice. So this is a big gathering on the worship of images. The Abbé Vallet, in descending that decision, which tended to the images again, which tended to which tended to Blythe both the use and adoration of images. Yeah, that's it, Blythe. Had been obliged to have recourse up to those frivolous and incomprehensible distinctions of which the Nicene Fathers availed themselves, probably for the purpose of obscuring what they were unwilling to elucidate, and what they foresaw would prove equally repugnant to religion and common sense. In contradiction to the Abbé's assertions, though we have in most cases the greatest respect for his opinion, we must contend that a perusal of the canons of the Council of Nice is sufficient to convince any man of the plainest understanding that they were meant to enforce both the use and adoration of images. And here we are in the instant image age. In this light, they were considered at the time by the prelates of England, who met for the purpose of examining them. By the orders of Offa, or Ossa, king of Mercia, who had received a copy of the canons from Charles, his friend and ally. They condemned them as containing many things contrary to the true Catholic faith, especially the worship of images, which the Catholic Church utterly detested and abhorred. This sentence of the English bishops had been transmitted to Charles prior to the convocation of the Council of Frankfurt, and the prelates who attended the council were convinced of its justice. they adopted the same opinion of the canons of the Council of Nice, an elaborate confutation of which they drew up in 4 books, which were published in the king's name and are commonly called the Carline books. Okay, first mention of Carline in this often called Carolingian era. The Abbé Vallée is of opinion that these prelates were mistaken with regard to the interpretation of the condemned canons, and that this mistake was owing either to their ignorance of the Greek language or to the introduction of false canons, instead of those which were enacted by the Second Council of Nice. The first supposition appears to us to be highly frivolous. Why are we to suppose that the Fathers of Frankfurt were less learned than the Nicene Fathers? Independent of their equality in point of rank, the former had a vast superiority of numbers. There were 300 prelates at the Council of Frankfurt, and but 150 or thereabouts at that of Nice. Among the former 2 was Alcuinius, who is confessed by the Abbé himself to have been a man of great learning and profound erudition. The second supposition is still more untenable, for the interval between the 2 councils is so short, that of Nice having met in 787, and that of Frankfurt in 794, that it is grossly improbable the Fathers of the latter could have been imposed on by a forgery, which must imply a total ignorance of the canons enacted by the former, when it is notorious, too, that a copy of the acts of that council was sent into France. The members of the council at Frankfurt, therefore, were perfectly justified in condemning what really tended to encourage a species of idolatry. Tassillon, the deposed Duke of Bavaria, appeared at this assembly in the habit of a monk to implore the clemency of Charles. He publicly confessed his repeated violations of oaths, and formally renounced, as well for himself as his sons, all his pretensions to the duchy, which he had forfeited by the treachery of his conduct. The king assigned him a pension and ordered him to be removed to the monastery of Juniges, where he passed the remainder of his days in company with his 2 sons. Queen Fastrade died about this time. Charles, who had loved her to excess, lamented her loss with great bitterness, but her pride and cruelty had rendered her odious to the nation. Twice had she exposed the life of her husband as a reward for the superabundance of his kindness towards her. As soon as the Council of Frankfurt was dissolved, the king marched against the Saxons. But the presence of a monarch who had so frequently signalized his prowess to their cost spread such a consternation among them that instead of flying to arms, they hastened to prostrate themselves at the feet of their master. Charles again received their submission, and contented himself with taking from them 1/3 of their army, which he distributed in different parts of his dominions. In 795, but even this diminution of their force proved inadequate to restrain them from farther attempts. Charles had advanced at the head of his troops to the banks of Elbe in order to give audience to the king of the Abodrites. When he learned that the prince, who was a firm friend as well as an ally of the French, had been killed in an ambuscade prepared for him by the Saxons, he was so enraged at the news that he abandoned the whole country to the fury of his soldiery, who extended their depredations from one end of it to the other, and slew above 30,000 of the inhabitants. In 796, Charles, in the course of this expedition, gave audience to the ambassadors of Theudon, a powerful chief of the Huns, who sent to assure him of the submission of that part of Pannonia over which he presided. From these envoys he learned that the Huns were considerably weakened by domestic commotions. He therefore judged it proper opportunity for attacking them. He sent orders for this purpose to Harry, Duke of Friuli, who fulfilled his commission with alacrity and success. Having forced the capital, he found it in immense treasure, the spoils of all the nations of Europe, which these barbarians had been accumulating for the space of 2 centuries. They were all sent to the king, who out of them distributed rewards to his nobles and his soldiers, and in short to all that had served him with fidelity. A part of his spoils, were destined for Adrian, but that pontiff died about this time, and his loss was deeply lamented by Charles, who ordered prayers to be read for the repose of his soul in all the churches in his dominions, and wrote his epitaph in Latin verse. The epitaph, which is engraven on his tomb at the entrance of St. Peter's Church. Leo III, Adrian's successor, sent legates to the king to make known his elevation to the chair of St. Peter, to carry him the standard of the city of Rome, and to beg he would send someone to receive from the Romans the oaths of fidelity and allegiance, which sufficiently proves that when the French kings ceded to the Pope the exarchat of Ravenna and Pentapolis, they by no means intended to give up the sovereignty of those territories. I'll try to stay on screen. I like my Hunchback of Notre Dame here. So a lot is going on. They claimed a lot from the Huns, apparently. The Huns, in the meantime, sacrificing private interest to public good, had chosen a prince, and under his conduct had taken possession of one of their principal forts. I think it was from the Huns where I got all those goodies again. I dare reread it, that's for sure. The Huns, in the meantime, they had their public interest taken possession of one of their principal forts. Charles, on this news, caused the King of Italy to collect the united forces of Lombardy and Bavaria and march against the new monarch, before he was in a situation to oppose him. Pepin accordingly traversed that part of Pannonia which is now called Austrasia. Oh no, I'm sorry, Austria. First time we have Austria. Okay, so he is now traversing. Pepin is over here in Bavaria, and Austria is a little lower. There's Salzburg. Okay. And past the Danube. I used to live along the Danube, not far from the capital of the country. The prince hastened to meet him at the head of an army which was chiefly composed of the principal nobility of the kingdom. The battle was long and bloody, but the Huns were at length defeated, and their brave commander slain. The city of Rinja was next reduced. It was pillaged and levelled with the ground. The garrison were put to the sword, and the inhabitants driven beyond the Tieve. The destructive expedition marked with the same cruelty which too frequently dishonoured the French arms, at this period extinguished the power of the Huns, a republic of warriors, distinguished for their bravery and their wealth. All their nobility fell to the course of those numerous battles which they fought in defence of their liberty. Such of the people as escaped the fury of the conqueror either submitted to the yoke of France or retired to the neighbouring states. The few commotions that afterwards occurred are less to be considered as the efforts of a powerful nation struggling for its independence than as the last convulsions of expiring liberty. So they are losing their liberty. If you notice, this is not really the map of France we know today. This is containing Austria and parts of Hungary. Pepin, loaded with the spoils of Pannonia, directed his march to Aix-en-Chapelle, whither his father, after having ravaged Saxony, had repaired with Luitgard, whom he had recently espoused. The young prince's march resembled a triumphal procession. His cloths, and those of his soldiers, shone with gold and silver. Such magnificence had never before been seen in France. He passed the winter with his father at Aix, where they celebrated the festivals of Christmas and Easter in a superb chapel which Charles had just raised in honour of the Blessed Virgin. This chapel gave the name of Aix-la-Chapelle to the town, which Charles afterwards made the capital of his empire. It was adorned with the finest marble that Rome and Ravenna could produce. The dome was embellished with a globe of solid gold. The gates and balustrades were of bronze. The vases and chandeliers of gold or silver, and all the ornaments displayed a richness and magnificence hitherto unexampled. The palace which the king had constructed at the same place was equally grand and superb. Some of its porticos, we are told by contemporary writers, were so spacious that all the troops and attendants of the king could dine in them. Over these porticos were apartments for the nobles who attended the court. This grand edifice was so contrived that the king, without leaving his room, could see every person that entered the other apartments. The thermae, or warm baths, were sufficiently large to contain 100 persons. In short, from the account of Eginhard, the palace of Aix-la-Chapelle appears to have been a work of uncommon extent and magnificence. In 797 A.D., the season was far advanced, and the king was preparing for an expedition to Saxony, when the Emir Zara arrived, who, having taken Barcelona, came to do homage to Charles and to acknowledge himself a vassal of the French monarchy. The king received him with kindness, and in order to quell the commotion which he learned from Zara still prevailed in Spain, he sent orders to the king of Aquitaine to repair thither with an army and lay siege to Hueca. Louis obeyed, but the success of his efforts is not known. Zara's example was followed by Adala, uncle to the new king of Cordova. That prince, eager to obtain possession of his inheritance, had recourse to the protection of the French monarch, who was then regarded by the generality, both of the Christians and infidels, as the arbiter of Europe. Charles promised to redress his grievances and took him into Saxony, where he had determined to pass the winter. Having fixed his camp on the banks of the Weser, he surrounded it with fortifications and erected so many houses that a town was speedily formed, to which was given the name of Heristal, which it still bears. But all his efforts to subdue the spirit of the Saxon were fruitless. Having sent them some commissaries to administer justice to such as should ask for it, they were all massacred. So here they come begging for justice, and they got massacred. This act of cruelty was followed by a prompt and decisive punishment. Charles laid waste the whole country between the Weser and the Elbe, but far from being dispirited, they prepared to retaliate, and entering Mecklenburg, began to commit the most dreadful devastations, when they were attacked by the governor of the country, and 4,000 of them put to sword. Weakened, though not discouraged, by such repeated losses, they were compelled to give hostages for their future fidelity, and Charles, disdaining to pursue his advantage, returned to his capital. The cares of government did not prevent the king from attending the conduct. He was attending to the conduct of his children. Find out what they're up to. You better. Some of them are going to oust you, apparently. He had ordered the king of Aquitaine to meet him at Heristal in order to give an account, not only one of his expeditions to Spain, but of the administration of his finances. That prince, preyed upon by a set of needy and rapacious courtiers, had been obliged, on his last visit to the court of France, to borrow money for the purchase of those presents which which it was customary to make to the king. Charles, being informed of it, represented to him in the most urgent manner the evil consequences arising from the prodigality of monarchs, which not only led to the ruin of their people, but reduced them to a state of dependence incompatible with the majesty of the throne. He had the satisfaction to find that his remonstrances were not ineffectual, that Louis had paid his debts and lived with dignity, without oppressing his subjects. The King of Aquitaine had 4 royal mansions: Douai on the confines of Anjou, Poitiers, Cassenuel in Argenois, Andillac in the Diocese of Exante, and Abuel in Auvergne. Okay, so he has his mansions out there. He made it a rule to pass a year at each of these successively. For the ancient kings of France scarcely ever resided in towns, whence they were only burdened with the support of the monarch and his court once in 4 years. The revenues, being duly administered, afforded a considerable surplus, by which means Louis, without exacting anything from his subjects, was enabled not only to defray the expense of his household, but to pay his troops, whom for that reason he forbade to exact forage from the country people. Charles was so well pleased with his conduct that he adopted it himself and ordered his troops to be paid in future out of his own revenue. All right, I better stop there. We are at King Louis of Aquitaine.